We're very happy to be doing this session. Both of us are, of course, former teachers, but former principals and district administrators, and we have worked in state capacities, and we know that we can have the best framework in the world, we can have the best curriculum, the best assessment, you name it, unless we pay attention to implementation, professional learning, systems and organizations, it's not going to happen, right? So we begged, actually, the group to allow us to do a session on leading implementation. So that's what we're here to do with you today. I'm Nancy Brynildson. I think I've met all of you already. And Joanne Iskin. I'll let you introduce yourself.
So my name is Joanne Iskin, and I am the chair of the Instructional Quality Commission, but really my identity is tied to 25 years as a principal, site principal, and years at the central office as an associate superintendent of instruction. And we know how important implementation is, that these are ideas without implementation. And Nancy and I spoke that I know for myself, whenever I would attend sessions like this, I would always be sitting there and thinking, okay, how am I going to make this work? How am I going to make this work? What do we need to be thinking about? So today, that's really what this session is all about. We're going to nudge you a little bit on some structural and systems issues to think about, but also particularly related to professional learning. We are going to give you time to listen and self-assess. Where do we think we are as a district on the things we need to do for implementation, or the school, or as a classroom teacher in the classroom? We are going to show you some tools that will be available to you to help move these conversations along back at your site, and then we'll give you some time to regroup and talk, hopefully with a school team or a partner or district partner with whom you've come to say what might be our next first steps.
Great, thanks. Just a word about the handouts. We'll be sort of dealing with them one at a time, so if you're missing something, you'll have a chance to get it, but we're kind of linear in that they are labeled handout 1, 2, 3, and 4, and in the PowerPoint, it's referenced on the slides when we're dealing with handouts 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that should make it a little bit easier for you. If you're missing anything, Carrie will get it to you, or we'll get it to you as we go along. So what we want to do first is really set the stage for work we do together, work you do together at your school sites and in your districts. How many of you are district administrators? How many of you are school administrators? How many of you are literacy coaches or program specialists of some sort? Yes. Classroom teachers, department chairs, and I probably have forgotten, higher ed faculty. Okay. This is as much about how you effectively work with adults as it is about knowing your content. But let's just start with the standards, because the standards themselves, we didn't just come up with this idea that collaboration is important. But the standards themselves insist, and this is a quote right out of the introduction, that instruction in reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language be a shared responsibility within the school. And the ELD standards are designed to be used by all teachers of academic content and of ELD. So this notion of working together and sharing responsibility is one that comes right out of the standards, and of course it spills right into classroom instruction. But for now, we're talking about adults working together. Now, for today's purposes, we're really thinking about the standards themselves as influenced by, as overlaid by all these other elements. And here's, okay, we don't need to see that again. But so let's deconstruct this a little bit. So if we're looking at ELA literacy and ELD standards, we're now really looking at three major undertakings. English language arts literacy in all disciplines. And ELA is not synonymous with literacy, right? And because ELA has its own content, but literacy applies to all disciplines, and then English language development in all disciplines. So right away, you see where folks are going to have to think across different categories and work together to achieve this. So I'm going to hand this to Joanne. We want to start this conversation with you about the work we're going to do to lead implementation of the framework, with you having an opportunity to do a little self-assessment.
Chapter 11, I think, is a brilliant resource on implementation. And what Chapter 11 references is the fix-in research. If you haven't read it on implementation, I strongly suggest you do. And the reference is in Chapter 11. But really, the most significant thing that you need to know that I want to reiterate is that we are on a long-term journey here. We're on a 3 to 5, possibly a 7-year journey here. So it's important for us to have that framework as we think about implementation, because you're going to be thinking about a lot of things that need to be done. But what we like to think about with the ELA-ELD framework is that the ELA-ELD framework is really the pivot point. It's the high leverage framework, because if you make some of the structural changes that are referred to in this ELA-ELD framework, you are leveraging the change that is coming with the next generation science standards, history social science framework, and everything that's coming from here forward. So I would say to you that as we put these issues out on the table, think about that and steps to take. So what you'll need, and I give you credit for being able to balance things on your lap and write at the same time, but what you'll need is the blue handout. Our intention on the blue handout is that you can use this as you go back to your districts, your sites, your leadership teams, and use this as a self-assessment tool to say, where are we on these various dimensions that will be necessary to implement the framework? And these are just a few areas to think about. But what I'm going to do with you for a couple of minutes now is, this is going to be the input part of the session, so this is going to be listening, and I'm going to come at you rather quickly. But I'm going to suggest some structural things that you ought to start thinking about from the beginning. So you can use this as a graphic organizer. You can see how I used mine to take notes. I'm going to refer you, as we look at each dimension, to where in the framework you can go to read about that particular structural dimension, and then maybe just some things to think about as you're thinking about changes that you may want to consider. So if you're on the side that says system-wide elements, that's the side where we'll be working together. So let me nudge you just a little bit. So in the area of vision, goals, objectives, and plans, we know that's the framework chapter 1 and 2, where the framework talks about the vision for California on the implementation of the Common Core. Obviously, as a school district, as a school, that's where you'll have to go back and think about, what does this mean for us in terms of the translation of that vision in our local site? But I want to throw out something that may be obvious. But as you think about rolling your vision forward, you've heard us talk a lot about the shared responsibility and collaboration. So what might that look like structurally in your school district or your county office or your school? It might look like starting to think about professional development sessions that are not just the ELA person talking about Common Core, but it's the ELA and the ELD person presenting together. It's the ELA, ELD, and history social science person presenting together. Because if we're really going to talk about shared responsibility and collaboration, those professional development, professional learning sessions need to model that same kind of step toward implementation, that these things are not isolated and discrete. If you look at instructional materials, I'll send you to chapter 12. You should definitely look at chapter 12 because it will describe the instructional materials that will be coming forward for adoption. So what are some issues you need to think about? What have we done with instructional materials? Are we using units of instruction? Are we creating them? Are we pulling them off the internet, like Engage New York? Are we looking at adopting a textbook or instructional materials? So what should you be thinking about in that regard? How does that line up with the framework? So what I can tell you is the publisher materials that are out now are not framework aligned. But the ones that will be coming forward in the spring are written to the California framework. They are being designed, they are being written. I can tell you they will come forward. They will include that designated time, designated ELD, integrated ELD, literacy across content areas. So it's coming, but you need to think about as a district or a school, what are we going to do with instructional materials? And look at those instructional materials, because for secondary, there is a program design for long-term English learners, grades 4 through 8, so be aware of that and read the description. Assessment systems. Obviously, that's Chapter 8. There's a session coming on assessment in the next hour. But what do you need to think about? You need to think about what are the assessments that we currently have in our school and our school district. And how are we going to possibly rethink those in light of what's in Chapter 8? And I would encourage you to come to get more information about that. But also, what systems are we putting in place to progress monitor for our English learners beyond just the CELT once a year? Because progress monitoring becomes increasingly important and very important as you're looking at what do you need to do in the designated ELD time, and how are you following that up in the integrated ELD time, and is it working? So, assessment. So think about calendars and schedules. That is Chapter 11, obviously, but I want to put that calendar and schedule issue up front. And I want to say, first of all, just to clarify, if you've heard that there are no minutes in the framework, I need to reinforce that. There are no prescribed minutes in the framework. Not for language arts, and not for ELD. So it now falls to you as a school district and a school to think about what do our students need and how will we use that time. And the reason there were no minutes in the framework was that we wanted to be sure that all students had access to a balanced curriculum. So that's something else to think about structurally. How might schedules change? What does that mean in terms of collaboration if you have an ELD pull-out teacher or support teacher? So think about that in terms of schedules. Think about things in terms of schedules for if we talk about shared responsibility and collaboration, how do you make time for collaboration? So whether that's collaborative lesson planning or collaborative time to look at student work, that'll be very, very important. And as you're looking at a middle school or a high school, and you're thinking about a master schedule, and you're thinking about planning periods, who has common planning time? If you want cross-disciplinary collaboration, if you want the ELD teacher collaborating with the social science teacher, how do you look at the planning periods? And do you think about those differently? And how do you use the school calendar so there's time for collaboration? So think about calendar issues. Intervention and support, that's Chapter 9. I would encourage you to read Chapter 9 as we move from RTI to MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. What does that mean? How is that more comprehensive? And how might that push you to think about your support systems, as well as how are you grouping students for ELD? How are you grouping them for their designated time, and how is that moving to a more collaborative model? As you look at leadership and staffing, again, that's Chapter 11, specifically Figure 11.8, because that pushes some ideas of how you can use staff to open up spaces for collaboration. So I send you particularly to Figure 11.8. Time, space, and technology, that's Chapter 10 and Chapter 11. Obviously, we're pushing the envelope on the integration of technology, so go into the framework to think about that. Professional learning, Chapter 11 is a master work on models of professional learning, some of which we'll get into with you today on ways of thinking about delivering professional learning. But time for things like lesson study, looking at student work beyond just the professional development itself. Data systems, Obviously, it's looking at tracking progress over time. So we're saying now that we're rethinking assessment, what kinds of information are we putting in the data system? And how are we using that to inform decisions that we're making? It may be different than the traditional benchmark with a number that's going into the system. Things to think about. And last but not least, it's on there, resources. That one is particularly important because people keep saying, and how do we fund this? And so I'm going to say to you, LCAP. That you are now at the point in the school year where you're going to revisit that LCAP. And you're going to, now you've had a year of experience, what is this and how do we write it? So now you know. So now there's an opportunity to say, how do we leverage the resources that we have as we're writing our LCAP to provide resources, funds, time, to offer things like instructional time, staffing, collaboration, all the things that we need to make that work.
Is data systems in Chapter 11 too?
Data systems, you may want to look at Chapter 8 on assessment to inform the kinds of things that you ought to be thinking about. So that's just a quick idea of a few things that you should be thinking about as you're thinking about the structural issues of implementing the framework. On the other side, you see professional knowledge and skills, more things to think about as you're thinking about implementing the framework. So there's the beginning. It would, you need a minute, right? So do you want to turn to a partner maybe or a neighbor with whom you've come and think about which of these structural issues are ones that you say, yes, these are things in our school or district that we really want to spend some time on. Well, I know when you put these things in front of principals and district people and county office people, you can run with implementation, right? So did anybody have any ahas or any realizations or any thoughts that came together for them? Because on implementation, anything that you're thinking about, you know someone else is thinking about. Yes?
Just like you said, if you can really put it in line with your LCAP. Like all the planning, even the goals, the budget it's tied to, it can all just be tied together in there, so you don't have this plan and that plan. WASP plan.
Talk about integration. There's a person who carries her LCAP with her. Hold up your, has it with her. But really, that's the way it should be, right? These things should integrate. Any other thoughts that you'd like to share? Okay, we are moving on.
So you started the process of assessing yourselves and your own systems. I'm going to spend a little bit of time going back to this notion of collaboration and a collaborative and learning school culture, or we could say organizational culture. This is a quote from Chapter 11, where we say that essential to successful implementation is the culture in which it's embedded. And there's some elements here that I think are really important. In that our position is that the kind of culture that's designed or that's facilitated, enhanced, grown, however you would term that, will really be important in terms of allowing certain things to occur. Establishing common interest. Professionals need to be truly interested in doing this work. For school goals, enthusiasm, creating enthusiasm. You know, I've talked to people, I've been in the business a long time, I don't want to tell you how many, I haven't hit year 40 yet, but I'm almost there. Okay, and I've had friends who said, oh, I'm so glad I retired before Common Core. I'm like, why? Aren't you happy? I'm thrilled, these standards are better. Why wouldn't you want to be in on like better standards? And they're like, I'm just too tired, I can't do it. So some of those attitudes are going to exist, and you're going to have to deal with creating a little enthusiasm for learning new content and pedagogy. What do you mean I got to get rid of all my PowerPoints, you know? Commitment to group processes. Just leave me alone. I just want to do my thing. Okay? I know how to do my thing. This, if anything, this is going to involve more people working together than ever before. And that isn't always easy because there's somebody who's always doing their crossword puzzle in the corner and you're going, darn it, we're all working hard. Would you put that thing down? You know, there are all those kind of human things that happen that you're going to have to deal with. And the only advice I think that Joanne and I have is that you're going to have to deal with it fairly openly. You're going to have to create norms. How do we work together? What constitutes respectful behavior? And, you know, all of those sorts of things. So we don't need to get too, like, you know, use touchy-feely about it, you know, using decades-old terms here. But it is important that we find ways to work together that are respectful and honors the places where teachers are right now. You know, it's not about you're all wrong. Everything you've done is wrong. No. We got to look at what we're already doing and build from there. So that's another piece of that. Group processes, momentum for a range of organizational structures needed to implement the standards. So if you're going to implement instructional rounds or lesson study or PLC, and there are so many collaborative structures, but they all require a certain commitment. People need to have buy-in. So I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but this needs some thought, and you're going to need to do some planning and some sort of soul searching about what really is the tone of our organization right now. Where are our weak spots? Where are our strengths? Where can we grow? Not easy stuff. So here's something that emerges out of, I think this is the Desimone research that's cited. You'll see that in a little bit. But she talks about 3 aspects for educator effectiveness. So one is just knowledge. I mean, there's certainly a lot to know, right? In terms of all of the content. You know, I think a lot of teachers are feeling like the ELD standards present a heavy lift for some of them in terms of what they know about language structures and all of that linguistic background. And so there's your knowledge. Disciplinary literacy, there's a lot to know about. But then it doesn't really matter what you know if our attitudes about, or our dispositions, if you will, don't go along with it. So we have to develop those dispositions, and that kind of goes along with the last slide in our discussion, to approach. We are talking about different stances towards students than maybe we've had in the past. And then finally, action. Because dispositions and knowledge without action in the classroom, in the school, in the district, in the county are essential. So those 3 elements, in other words, I need to learn things, I need to develop dispositions, and I need time to practice and try them out and get better at them. And it needs to be okay to be bad at stuff. You know, we are very proud as teachers. We do not want to admit that we haven't read that article, that we don't know something, and that we tried it and oh my God, I stunk at it. You know, we think we should be terrific from the beginning. Do we expect that from our students? No. So should we expect that from ourselves? No. We need to make it okay to admit that, gosh, I have things to learn, I'm struggling with things. So we have some items in handout number 2, which is what color? Someone help me. So, salmon, thank you. So here is what we're going to need you to do. If in a perfect world, you'd all have little round tables, right? We'd like you to work in groups of 3 if you can. And you have 5 items here that we would like you to split up. So somebody can take items 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and then number 5 is a little bit longer. Read those and then talk together. These are all descriptions of effective professional learning. These are sort of summaries of different studies that have been done on professional learning. So I'd like to give you a few minutes to do that right now. So you can just move your chairs if you need to work with a couple of other people. So in these instructions, we asked you to identify 3 or 4 common themes that your group thought were compelling. Anyone want to volunteer something you felt was compelling? Some common themes across these different reviews of the literature? Yes.
It needs to be practical. Doable.
Practical.
Something
Doable.
that actually manifest in the process.
Okay. Yes.
Ongoing.
Okay.
Over and over again.
Ongoing. Yes. Over time. Absolutely. Anything else? Yes.
I think the implementation part, having a plan for it and not having the professional learning just be random, like, oh, let's learn about this today or this month, and I kind of feel like I just know from my own schools that that's lacking. Like just reading this one, yeah, we do that. Like we're like, oh, let's learn about, it's
Yeah.
not something long for the plan for it.
Right. Good. Yes.
We need to change the focus here of the active learning, to drive that active learning, with changing the culture, even of the staffing, so that we empower our teachers and our staff to show what it looks like. Because a lot of times we're doing a lot of talking, we're not paying attention to the voices of success.
Right. Absolutely. So there are many themes here that cut across. And in the session we did in San Diego, some people said, well, why, this one mentions this one, and it's also mentioned here, and, this one was only about English learners. The point here is that professional learning has been studied for quite a while, and some of the same things keep popping up about it needs to focus on something that teachers value, that's practical, that's content, it's active, and that's going to be practiced in the classroom, etc. Planning is a huge issue here. I think you've seen that in terms of planning for instruction, but also planning for professional learning. You're going to really have to backwards map what you're going to do in your professional learning programs. So to close this out, I want to leave you with this quote on this topic from the framework. And I think the part in bold is the most important. Ultimately, effective professional learning should mirror effective classroom instruction. We are challenging our students intellectually. We need to challenge our teachers intellectually. They need to be invited and encouraged to see themselves as intellectuals who are in a profession with power and authority to make decisions for children, students, young people. And so that might be a bit of a shift over the last few years. And it's going to require that, and we need to bring people along without them feeling like everything I just did was not worth it, or you're just telling me to throw out everything that I believe in, or everything that I put all this effort and energy into, now you're changing it. We want to make sure we label well what we're still doing. Okay. So I'll leave you with that and turn to Joanne.
So now we've nudged your thinking a little bit about what we mean by professional learning, right? And how comprehensively we're thinking about that, which ties you back to the blue sheet and calendar. How do you find time to do all those things? Because though I think we could probably, I would venture to say, everybody in this room would agree that every time you talk about Common Core standards, the one thing that you hear is we need time. So if we, as those responsible for structuring implementation, do not provide the time, we can't expect that we'll really see a difference in the classroom. So now we've pushed the idea about what should professional learning look like, and now let's talk about, so what are the things that you might be talking about in the professional learning? So you take your yellow handout. The yellow handout is also from chapter 11. And what we've done for you on this one page is synthesize all of the areas that are covered in chapter 11 that we think you ought to consider for professional learning. So we're going to give you some time to look these over and then talk to your team again. Look at the areas and say, of these areas, which do we think we have spent time on that we think are fairly strong for us? And which are the areas that you may need to spend more time on, that you may want to go back and say, this could be an area or some areas of focus for us for next steps. So we'll give you time to do some reading and talking.
So did you find that there were several areas where you had already begun work? Yes. And did you also find that there were some areas where you needed to start doing some work? So I think the other interesting thing is that if you look at the categories here, so many of them cut across disciplines. So the piece on 21st century learning, that's not just DLA and ELD, that's other subjects as well. So again, we're trying to give you tools to take back to use in planning your professional learning. In chapter 11, we talk a lot about collaboration and collaborative structures. We talk about communities of practice sort of in the lowercase generic sense, because as you know, there are lots of different communities of practice. I've mentioned a few already. There are PLCs in the formal Dufour model. There are instructional rounds. There are lots of different ways for people to work together, and probably you're going to use some combination of those. But the commonalities here, and that's what's most important, is that these are opportunities for educators to work together, to reflect on their practice and form social and professional bonds. You saw that from the research, that the social bonds reinforce the professional bonds. And develop shared understandings. You know, that can often be what I think I've been doing as formative assessment may not be what Robert thinks is formative assessment. And so we need to come together and get down to business and really say, well, is this it? No, is that it? You know, come up with that. Collaborate on problems of practice using evidence. So it just didn't go well. Well, what do you mean? Based on what? Why? Such as student work and assessment data. Just because we're focusing on formative assessment does not mean we won't have student work to look at and data, right? And go to Robert's session and learn more about that. So we haven't moved away from this notion of looking at student data. How do you help teachers view their teaching from a critical stance? Confront challenging topics and engage in difficult conversations. I know there's a lot of work that's been done, especially in having the hard conversations, but this is hard and it takes building trust. It may mean, how do you establish trust? Part of it is stability, not having everyone on staff change, not having all the administrators and department chairs change. It's sticking to a commitment to follow through on a topic or on a practice, etc. But building trust, and then some of you can't control those things. The sand is shifting under your feet. So how does trust get engendered, and how do you form it even under less than ideal circumstances? So that's when you come down to this last bullet, provide mutual support and mutual accountability. Because it's really about we need to support one another in this work, but we also need to hold ourselves accountable for getting stuff done. A lot of folks, when they started implementing the Common Core, and I think Bill Honig kind of touched on this at the beginning, oh, let's go plan an inquiry project-based unit, and we're all off. Well, hey, they need to fit together. And not everything is taught in a project-based unit. And, all that has to be thought through. You kind of have to plan the whole year and all the grades and all the disciplines. So that's a heavy lift. It's a heavy lift. Learn to deal constructively with conflict. There will be conflict. I'd rather, I've had the blessing of working with some people who were quick to tell me their views, either of me or whatever I was doing. And I used to say, underneath what seemed like hurtful kind of confrontation or whatever, there's a kernel of truth there that I need to listen to. Okay, so if I can get past the fact that my feelings are hurt and engage that more constructively, that's what we do with parents who are coming in and they're upset with the teacher, et cetera, or with two teachers who are upset with each other. Or, in other words, what do we need to deal with, and what's the other, it's sort of like how do we smooth out our ways of interacting with each other. But dealing with conflict, it's going to happen. And focusing on their improvement to achieve student improvement, so keeping students at the fore. So these are just some things to keep in mind as you think about your actual structures, professional structures. There's another section in Chapter 11 that called Program Supports that I'll just mention here. And because it goes into the mix in terms of planning how time is used and resources are used, specialists and other staff, you may have reading specialists, language development specialists, teacher librarians. That's your second bullet. And all of your special education, teachers and specialists, behavior specialists, you name it. So how all those people work together, are they co-teaching? Are they working alone? All those decisions. Expanded learning programs, i.e. before and after school. All that extended time. How is that going to fit together? Parents and families and partnerships. And I'll tell you something that nobody's asked today, probably several things, but one is the issue of double blocking in middle school and high school came up many times in our deliberations about the framework. And the framework committee was pretty clear that they were not encouraging it. Now that doesn't mean we're not meeting students' needs, but the folks who are saying where students lose, they lose history, social science, science, physical education, visual and performing arts, world languages. So how do we look at meeting students' needs without just going to everything is a double block, or it's a triple block, or it's whatever. Maybe it is an extended learning day. So there are very hard decisions to make here. Yes?
For the elementary folks, double blocking?
Like 2 periods of ELA. So, or a period of ELA and then another one that is the remedial, quote unquote, period. Or in some cases, 3 periods. That's why there are no minutes in the framework. That's why we don't say it's 180, it's this or that. And folks in the back asked me about that. At the end, I want to ask you to, pose that to the whole group because I think they might be interested. So there are some sections in this chapter that you may want to look at relative to program supports. They are part of what's on that blue sheet that Joanne went over with you. Okay?
The last thing that we want to do with you, because we've talked about all the possible professional learning structures, we've given you an opportunity to think about what you might be talking about in your professional learning. So now we want to move you forward to what could be the hardest thing, which is how do you open these conversations? How do you begin? So we want to direct you to tools that are in the framework. So if you take your green handout, what's in the green packet are pages, figures, sections of the framework that allow you to open the conversation on what we see to be some of the real challenging issues where the paradigm is shifting in the framework. So what we want to give you time to do is to look at these tools and talk about how, oh, I can do this the old-fashioned way, how you might use them. So take a look at the green, let me send the list back here. And maybe identify, since we don't have groups of 6, identify 1 or 2 of the issues that you think are significant issues in your setting. And then look at the tool that's here to open the conversation. Look it over and then turn back to your partner or your school team, share what that resource is and says, and talk about how you might use it for professional learning. Should I give you that list again so you see what's here? Pick 1 or 2 and take a look at the tool. What are your issues? Such good conversations happening. I hope this really helped your thinking. Did this help you to see some tools that are in the framework to start the conversation on some issues? Yeah, we definitely know that there are probably 10 more we could have added to this list, but these seem to be the ones. And again, as we said, if you address these in the ELA-ELD cycle, you'll have also addressed them for science, social science, and everything that comes after. So what we wanted to do in the remaining few minutes were 2 things if we can. 1, allow time for questions that you may have that hopefully Nancy and I can answer, and if not, we'll refer you to possible sources. And then for the last at least 2 minutes, give you a chance to get back with your team and say, what do we really need to remember as we go back on implementation? So questions that you may want to ask or that came up for you? Anyone? Should we have the question?
Our colleagues in the back, would you pose the question
Sure.
you asked me?
I just needed clarity. You made the statement about there are no prescribed minutes for the ELA, ELD standards. I was under the assumption that there were 30 minutes required by CDE for ELD instruction, but apparently not. And there never was, apparently.
It was a rule of thumb that was used in doing compliance reviews. And when this question was posed in San Diego, I think it was Elena who answered it by saying, think of it not so much as a number of minutes, but being prepared to answer the questions about who are your English learners? What is their level of proficiency? What are you doing with them in the curriculum? How are they receiving designated ELD? What progress are they making? How do you know? So it's really not about so many minutes. It's about the bottom line. What are we really doing? And what are we really accomplishing? And how is that helping students move forward in all their content areas? So it's just not quite as tidy of an answer. but I think it's more meaningful if we look at it in that way. So
that was the answer from the Title III Accountability Office.
that if you weren't able to answer those questions that I just posed,
Right.
then you're probably going to have a compliance issue.
Yes.
Yes.
This also might not be tidy.
Nothing is.
Do you know how reclassification is going to change? Both in the future with the new standards and also currently how people are approaching it in the interim without CSP?
Do you want to answer that,
I
Robert?
know exactly how it's going. Just kidding. Basically, there's a large rethinking going on in light of the new standards, and California is part of a national conversation around moving towards more common thinking in the processes and tools and procedures for defining who's ready to exit, who is an English learner, who gets classified as English learner. And part of the discussion, nothing's been decided yet, but it's very clear that what replaces the self is going to be much more rigorous and much more reflective of the kinds of language demands that you need to engage in the disciplinary practices that you see in the world. The other thing is I think there's a discussion about what role does academic achievement criteria play? Because there are many students who are not ELs who don't meet those academic achievement criteria. Should we be keeping kids EL for not meeting that? So there's a real focus on what are the language uses, and I think that's where the conversation is going. But I think the main thing is if you focus on implementing Common Core and paying attention to the framework, you will be aligning with where the notions of reclassification are going. Reclassification is not the whole story, it's not the end of the story. So I think that's the broad view.
Other questions? Yes.
I'm just thinking, the 30 minutes is really not enough when you're thinking about, Robert's response as well. Is that 30 minutes of designated ELD in addition to all the integration that needs to happen across content is the bare minimum that we've given this where our English learners are right now is the bare minimum of what we can do. And ELA minutes are not, written down. Math minutes are not written down.
That's right.
So do we not do ELA math as well?
That's right.
Right?
So that's just the reframing the thing.
And in fact, that reflects part of the response I gave them when we were talking before, and it's that, to me, that sounds like at least 30 minutes, if not more.
That's right.
So, but it's how you bring those pieces together, because the integrated ELD across the content, across all the disciplines, should be leveraging, now that we're not just looking at sheltering students in, or scaffolding or sheltering students in a discipline, but actually having them learn language within that discipline. That's a different twist. And we ought to be able to leverage that for that increased progress. But that's why giving an answer of exactly how many minutes is just not possible to do. And what we know about content is that the more students have in content, the more they have to bring to literacy, the more they have to bring to language. Yes.
Even though it's not required in terms of minutes, in order to provide students with access to a full range of curriculum that they need, it is a required piece.
Yes. Designated ELD is required.
And in fact, the phrase that's used, and there was a session on this, is both and. So there's no minutes, but it is required.
Correct.
Well, I think we may be there.
Yeah, we're two. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.